so much for coming down this afternoon. We've got an hour. This is a rapid response event, as Sean was saying. So there are going to be ups and downs. It's going to move along very quickly. And we're going to be throwing to some people on Skype as well. So you might occasionally hear me ask for somebody to be queued up. So as the NSA might say, we've got a lot to get through in that time. So I'm going to introduce our guests here. We have got Arthur Doohan, who's the national organiser for the would-be Pirate Party in Ireland. Billy Hawkes is the Data Protection Commissioner. Mary Redmond from Trinity is a digital media specialist in the Computer Science Department. We've also got Ken McDonough from DCU, who specialises in counter-terrorism and security. Dropping in on Skype this afternoon, we have Casper Bowden, who's the former Chief Advisor on Privacy for Microsoft. Sive McCarthy is the Director at the Centre for Irish and European Security in Brussels. And Alexander Klimberg is a key advisor to various governments and international organisations on cyber security. So how it's going to work is the guests are going to speak for a couple of minutes each when I throw questions to them. Going to be moved along quickly, so I'm generally not this brusque in other situations, but we do have a limited period of time. And the main focus of this as well is to get the most diverse range of opinions and facts in as possible, so we all go away incredibly informed / confused. Why are we here? Okay, last weekend a guy called Edward Snowden, who'd been talking to The Guardian since earlier this year, broke a gigantic story. That's the Jenga thing falling outside, which you might hear time to time. A security agency called the National Security Agency, or as people in the security community like to joke, no such agency or never say anything, are apparently behind a project called Prism. Now, the interesting thing about this leak is that there is a dispute about what Prism actually is. According to the Prism documents and according to Snowden himself, the NSA has obtained direct access to the systems of various tech companies. This may or may not, it has been claimed, is run with the knowledge or assistance of companies or not at all. We don't actually know. There's a lot of confusion about it. The director of the National Intelligence in the States says Prism is not an undisclosed collection or data mining program, but an internal government computer system used to facilitate statutorily authorized collection of foreign intelligence information from electronic comm services providers under court supervision. This goes back to some dialogue between the NSA and tech companies over the past couple of years under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which we'll refer to now as FISA. And basically they're using that as a way to gather online users' data with the cooperation of several tech companies such as Facebook, Apple, Google, and so on. If you can imagine these kind of big companies as huge, big, giant warehouses full of information, the NSA developed a system with them where they would have a little porch where some data was available to them without them having to go through the back door. That's what they're saying. There is a dispute on that, whether Prism is more of a jump through the window type vibe and kind of grab that for themselves. So that's the rub, really. Is it a convenient gathering facet of FISA, facilitated and widely reported, a data warrant type situation, or is this a backdoor kind of violation? And what are the implications for that? What does that mean for us? What does that mean for the world? What does that mean for the bigger picture in terms of privacy, in terms of trust, and all those kind of things? So, Ken, the reason for this thing, Prism and the NSA in general, is constantly told to us that it's due to security. Is this a necessary tactic?
Well, it's certainly a tactic that the agencies would argue has been particularly useful, and it emerges, I suppose, in the broad context or the specific context is September the 11th, and the idea that the Patriot Act gave wide-reaching powers to the Bush administration and the newly set up Department of Homeland Security to do whatever it takes to protect the homeland. And what we've seen since then is the slow sort of pulling back of that, or at least some sort of oversight being put in. So that led to the FISA Act, for which you referred to there. It also led to, after an earlier leak in 2006 about phone tapping, to the sort of some clearer guidelines on how the US government can access phone records. It's worth pointing out that this didn't start on September the 12th as such. This kind of liberty security argument has been going on for quite some time, and since the origin of the state, arguably. And there's a great article by a guy called Hayes Brown in Foreign Policy on this, where I think the subtitle is something along the lines of America, infringing on liberty for security since 1789, and he gives some great historical examples of when the state has done that. What's different now is the scale of information that's available and the width or the breadth of the dragnet that's there. Now, the agency's argument is that, yes, it's useful. It allows them to identify, what they call bad guys and track them down. And I think the head of the NSA made the argument that it has prevented dozens of attacks, but of course, he can't tell you which ones or sort of how effective it was without, sacrificing some of their methods. On the other hand, it's a large temptation to have this large bank of data, which is information on a wide range of people, or at least potentially a wide range of people, and specifically in the context of the recent IRS scandal in the US, where a sub-office of the IRS, specifically targeted groups for their political leanings. And in that context, it raises serious questions about who can be trusted with this data.
In terms of the breadth of this data, we're talking about huge amounts. We're kind of being made aware now of an NSA data mining tool called Boundless Informant, which is a metadata cataloging system which takes all of massive amounts of data and then kind of catalogs them in different kind of ways and under different categories. And then, to give you a scope of that, in a 30-day period in 2013, that Boundless Informant cataloging system, catalogued and kind of obtained 3 billion pieces of intelligence from US computer networks. So this is big.
Yeah, well, I've learned a new word this week, and I think it's a little bit like after the financial crisis, we got used to billions and the way we used to be used to millions. Now the zettabyte is coming out there as a unit of data measurement that is absolutely enormous. The thing to say about that, and again, the NSA, Keith Anderson was up in front of the House Appropriations Committee yesterday, supposed to be talking about cybersecurity, but inevitably led back to this. And he gave some interesting insight into how they're using this data, because as I said, this amount of data would just generate, no matter how good your algorithm is, such an amount of leads or potential leads that you couldn't possibly have the resources to follow them up.
Yeah.
So it seems to be the way they're using it is they are targeting around some other intelligence and working from there. So they are picking and choosing the data that they use. I'm not sure if that can be kind of cold comfort to the fact that the data is there and accessible, and how they choose those targets is perhaps less than clear.
Billy, what are the implications for us here, from an Irish data protection point of view, and also what existing legislation at a European level that we're also party to, is similar to these kind of data mining or data retention exercises?
Well, generally, as Europeans, our data is pretty strongly protected. We have got fairly strong laws giving us control over our data, limiting disclosure and so on. But the but is that where law enforcement comes in, there are significant exemptions. So our own Data Protection Act here says that any organisation can reveal data to the Gardaí if they're investigating a crime without telling people. And then separately, as post 9/11 and across Europe, we have data retention laws which say telecommunications companies must hold on to information on our telephone traffic and where we're located, and the Gardaí, the Army and the Revenue Commissioners have fairly ready access to that if they're investigating a crime and so on. So the issue here, of course, is that the access is actually being done in the US and under legal compunction directed to US companies. So we are, to a large degree, bystanders, I think, in this from a legal point of view. If you can take cold comfort, there's a sort of heat map published as part of this leak, and it shows that Ireland is marked green, which shows that we are of very little interest to the NSA. So happily, I think Irish residents, as you'd expect, are not of huge interest to the NSA.
In terms of our own, or the European Data Retention Act, you're talking about the powers that gives the Gardaí, the Army and the Revenue Commissioner. A lot of people aren't aware, of that act in terms of how it impacts on our real life. So what does that act specify to you, me and everyone here? What powers do the Gardaí and so on have in terms of retaining our data?
Okay. First of all, there's an obligation on the telecommunications providers to retain the data. As a matter of law, they must retain data, in Ireland's case, between 1 and 2 years, in case it would be useful for the investigation of crime. After that, the Gardaí, for example, a superintendent can sign a letter saying, I am investigating a crime, I want access to Billy Hawkes's phone records. And that obviously is my mobile phone, where I was at a particular time, and so on.
But not the content.
Not the content. No, the content, to get content, they've got to go to a higher level. There's a separate piece of legislation which is older, about tapping phones essentially, which is more stringent in terms of the hoops that the Gardaí must go through. But and there is an oversight system with a judge in charge of it, so there is some form of oversight of it. But I think the one that's used most regularly is in fact the access to the phone records, because again, it is fairly easy for the Gardaí, the Army and the Revenue to access those records, as it just requires a signed piece of paper from an official or a superintendent. So I think this was part of the post-9/11 suite of laws introduced just about across all of Europe and, of course, in the US as well. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to bear in mind that it is not only the US government, but in fact governments throughout the world have, particularly post-9/11, introduced laws which would have been unthinkable in the past, again, because of the public demand to protect us from terrorism.
For the position that you're in, how do you feel about Prism? How do you feel about the implications?
The implications they're the same type of implications as arise for us in relation to data retention. In other words, you are hopefully you're expecting that the US, being a democratic country, does have proper oversight over this system. In other words, that a judgment has been made that it is proportional to do this massive data mining exercise in order to try to identify people who would be a threat to the United States. And your hope is that that is done in a careful way, and that the oversight mechanisms which do exist in the US and which have been, again, made public arising from Prism, that they are effective. And again, you have on the one hand the whistleblower saying, I could access anybody's data, even though I'm only working for a contractor for the NSA. And furthermore, there's direct access to the servers. On the other hand, you have the company saying, no, we never give direct access to the servers. We only act on legally binding orders under FISA and to access specific types of information. So I think we are hoping that, first of all, the review mechanisms for these laws are being used, because they have to be renewed every so often, including the data retention laws at European level are being reviewed at present, and that there's serious questioning of the proportionality of these laws. In other words, show us that you actually need this type of access to our information. Show us the results in terms of, let's say, the terrorist plots that you've managed to foil. And I think part of the problem is because it's security intelligence, that type of information is not revealed. So we're told more or less, trust us, it has been useful to us and the safeguards are adequate. But it's important that the pressure be maintained on the safeguards.
Okay, thanks, Billy. Mary, that kind of, that trust element, right? So somewhere between the whistleblower, the tech companies, the intelligence agencies, the government, the politicians, and everyone else in between, somewhere along the line, somebody's being a little versatile with the truth, perhaps. Where do you lie in terms of what you believe Prism to actually be?
Well, having read about it for the last week, it does seem to me that one country and one political power, in fact the US, has got a massive operation to collect and mine data that all of us individuals, as we roam around in our daily lives, and they're collecting that data and they're going through it and deciding what is dangerous or what data is important to them. So it looks to me, from what I've read about it, I'm not at all surprised to hear about this program. The different software companies that have signed up, if you look at, they say the first one that signed up was Microsoft in 2007, and the latest one that has involved in the program is Apple in 2012. And I suppose it's my view that these companies, these huge multinational companies, go in and they work in different countries in the world, and they negotiate those arrangements through some political deal. and they operate, they break the tax laws, they break all kinds of laws. So there's some kind of dealing that goes on, I think, on a global political level. And that's what scares me. I mean, the whole program in the US, I was listening to Noam Chomsky there, he was in Dublin a couple of months ago, talking about Obama sitting down weekly and deciding where he's going to send his drones next week. Well, where's Obama getting that information from? The scary thing is that it is one country, it is America, that has the resources, that has the money, that has the infrastructure to collect the information, and they can decide how they're going to act on it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, it's one political power, yet it is a global network.
Yes.
Can we get Casper on the line there, Donny? Thanks, Mill. One of the things, just as a complete side note, in terms of, I don't know how many people, saw the actual alleged Prism slides, but I thought they looked really rudimentary. Did anybody else think that? I mean, it was kind of like these, Apple, AOL, and then an arrow get all of this stuff. It
is a feature of Department of Defence planning slides. They are terrible at designing these things. They really are awful, but they can also do nothing without PowerPoint. So if you do want to challenge the US military, take out PowerPoint.
Yes.
Good to know.
They stole the logo?
The Prism logo?
The actual Prism logo is a picture by Adam Hart Davis, the UK science journalist.
Amazing.
And as far as he's aware, they didn't, they didn't ask for permission to take it or anything like that. So they're,
they should have taken it from Pink Floyd. Casper Bowden on the line now. Casper, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Very pleased to be with you. Thanks for asking.
Thank you very much for being with us. Really appreciate your time. Now, Casper, you worked at Microsoft in the privacy department, if that's what it's called on the door. Does this level of data gathering surprise you?
I'm sorry, the line is a bit crackly. Could you repeat the question, please?
Just that in your previous work at Microsoft and privacy, does this level of data gathering surprise you?
What level of data gathering?
Prism.
Well, I mean, sorry, I don't want to start off nitpicky, but it's very unclear what's going on with Prism. On the one hand, you have the Washington Post reports, and since then you've had a number of denials from different companies. David Drummond, the chief legal counsel of Google, was on Channel 4 a couple of days ago saying that they just have a paperwork system. They just receive different kinds of orders from the government, they process them and give the data back. So, who should we believe? I think looking at the material we have from Prism, the first thing I'd say is that what Washington Post said is totally consistent with the report which I wrote with others back to the European Parliament in December, and also that this FISA 702 law is extraordinarily powerful. So I guess the first thing to say is that even if the level of data extraction, and I think we're talking about the extraction of data which Google and Facebook actually have already just from you using their service, rather than collecting new data. But even if the amounts of data being disclosed are relatively targeted and small, the power of the law in question, which is the subject of the report that we wrote, is mind-blowing. And actually, if it brings focus to the potential risk from this law, I'd be very happy about that.
Can you explain a little bit of that section 702? What is that? What does that say?
So Section 702 is essentially what happened in 2008 to try and sweep under the carpet the so-called warrantless wiretapping affair. In 2003, a technician in AT&T San Francisco's office discovered that a secret room was being built in his switching center, and it contained a top-of-the-line deep packet inspection box and an optical fiber carrying most of the traffic of the western seaboard of the United States was being fed in one side. It was somehow scanning the traffic as it went by and then sending off on a splitter some part of that traffic to the National Security Agency. This emerged in 2005 in the New York Times, and there was a raging scandal about it in America for a couple of years. So just before Obama got elected, he basically dropped his opposition to making this warrantless wiretapping permanent. We still don't know exactly what happened. There were some different sorts of programs, and it's never been entirely clear what was content, what was traffic, what was international, what was domestic. But the long and the short of it is the result was Section 702. And Section 702 says that it only applies if you're not American and you're outside the United States. So I say only, but of course that's the rest of the world. That's us. And it says that there's a YouTube video if you want the full story, but the long and the short of it is that you don't have any privacy protection as a foreigner abroad at all. Nothing. So the disturbing thing from my point of view is the breadth of foreign intelligence information. That's the term that it authorizes the capture of. And foreign intelligence information, again, when you look into very complicated legislation, it means not just what you think of terrorism, money laundering, serious crime. It also means, quite literally, information with respect to a foreign territory that relates to the pursuit of US foreign policy. Now that's incredibly broad. That could mean absolutely anything.
Yeah.
So, in other words, what we've got is a carte blanche for political spying abroad with no privacy protection at all. And I think that's what should worry people.
And what do you think about the reaction to this whole story, these things that you're saying, which are so shocking, but at the same time, we've been quite conditioned to be apathetic about such breaches of privacy, given that privacy is now viewed as almost an historical artifact, really. This kind of attitude of, I can't believe these secret agencies have been spying on us, how do you feel about that? I mean, do you think people need to really kind of wake up to the breadth and depth of these projects, essentially?
Well, it's a good question. I think, yes, there has been a desensitization towards privacy issues, particularly through social networks and Facebook. But I must admit, I'm tired of hearing the argument from securocrats that just because all of us, well, not me actually, but all of us supposedly are happy to put our personal details on Facebook, this somehow means that state surveillance doesn't matter anymore. I don't buy that. Moreover, it seems to me that there's important questions that arise of ways that surveillance power can be abused when it's your own state spying on you. But there's a different set of questions, equally important set of questions, that arise when a foreign state is spying on you. And I think when I released when I briefed some journalists about the report we wrote back in January, there was a spontaneous reaction from all across Europe through Twitter, and the general reaction was, what on earth is the point of this highfalutin European data protection edifice if it can't protect us from a foreign state outside the EU doing political spying? And I think that is something people should think about. Is the data protection that we have in Europe, is that up to the job? Is that, in fact, just a bloated bureaucracy that doesn't really know what it's doing when it gets anything technical near it?
Mm-hmm. Just one more question for you, Casper. Leaving aside the work of states on this kind of things and government, from your experience, what is the attitude of tech companies towards data retention, data mining, user trust and privacy? What's the general attitude right now?
Well, I would say that there is an enormous cultural difference between European-based companies and American companies, from my experience with Microsoft. I would say that countries around Europe differ, and I would say the UK doesn't really take data protection very seriously, for example, and Germany does take it very seriously. And that matters to the extent that the lawyers inside a company will respond to things like requests from law enforcement. Are they essentially just going to say, oh, the police want some data, oh, here they are? Or will they actually be punctilious and say, can we resist this? Do we want to do this? Is this something that we think is right? And I think there is a spectrum of conscientiousness, if you like, and that is something to be borne in mind when you're choosing cloud computing providers too. If you're going to choose a cloud computing provider that will be a pushover for a foreign government, or one that will put up a light if they can, that makes a difference. The other thing I have to say about my experience with American corporations is, bluntly speaking, I don't know who's in the audience there, but if part of an American corporate executive's job to go abroad and lie to his corporation. You can't believe anything they say necessarily. I don't necessarily take the face value of any of the lies because there's nothing at stake. I mean, if they were subject to billions of dollars of fines, if they could be put on trial for perjury, then I might take seriously what they say. But of course, there's nothing like that at stake here, because the other thing you have to bear in mind about the FISA 702 law is it provided total immunity in American civil courts. They can't be sued for anything as a result of this in America. So what are the penalties they face in Europe? Not very much, frankly, at the moment.
Listen, Casper, thank you so much for taking your time. It's been really enlightening. Really appreciate it.
Can I listen to a bit more of the debate, maybe?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you
Okay.
can go, we're going to take a couple more Skype calls, but you can go to sciencegallery.com/live.
Oh, I see. You need this line, do you?
We do, unfortunately, yeah. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, sorry. I thought I was participating in the whole debate. Never mind. Well, look, if you want to come back in later, then just get back to me.
Will do. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, that was pretty enlightening, wasn't it? I'm going to zoom out a little bit here and go to Arthur on some of the things that Casper touched on in terms of the civil liberty implications, you know, the kind of big picture stuff. You have a very specific viewpoint on this, but I want to ask you about what you think the civil liberty implications are for something like Prism, Freudian, and basically just kind of give a bit of insight around from that side of things.
Sure. Well, the mantra from government on all of this stuff is trust us, we have your best interest at heart, and we know what we're doing. Now, post 9/11, post weapons of mass destruction, post global financial crisis, post all kinds of cover-ups and lies that we've been treated to down centuries, and certainly in the last 15 years, I'm sorry, I don't trust you, and I don't think you're competent. You know, they're just all the time going to build bureaucracies, defend their own self-interest, try and defend their reputations, and this stuff doesn't work. They didn't stop 9/11. You know, they don't have any foresight on these things. When you see results, security forces achieving results, it's either on the basis of human intelligence or it's on the basis of random good luck and having lots of police around. Classically, the 5 guys in the UK who were just sent to jail for 20 years for going to bomb an English Defence League thing were stumbled upon by accident by a policeman who stopped the car because they had a defective light or something like that, and it was found. They did not manage to stop the horrible murder in Woolwich a couple of days ago. They generally do not have any successes. Another piece of news, Osama bin Laden didn't have a Facebook page, you know, and 9/11 didn't get planned on a Google Doc. The bad guys, and there are a few very bad people out there, are not using the internet in the way that we are. So in Bruce Schneer's famous phrase, this is all the theater of security. When a bad thing happens, they're embarrassed by their failure. They need to cover it up, or they need to be doing something. So suddenly it's, oh look, this is something needs to be done. Oh look, this is something, therefore let us do this. The Patriot Act was pulled out of somebody's bottom drawer, where it had been waiting for an opportunity for people to grab more authority, more power, in a drawer somewhere. It was produced within 2 weeks of the 9/11 disaster, right? So these people, their instinctive reaction is always to try and take more of your liberty away. Now, Benjamin Franklin famously said, those who would trade liberty for security deserve neither. I think it's slightly more complicated than that. Those who trade liberty for security get neither liberty nor security. And in an open, globalized world, where people want their green beans delivered freshly from Kenya and their carnations from Costa Rica, cannot have a world where nobody can come in and commit an occasional act of violence, commit an occasional atrocity. But that level of terrorism is not a threat to our economy. It cannot pull our world down. What pulls our world down is when somebody has a stupid overreaction and goes and spends $2 trillion on a war that embarrassed them, that has achieved absolutely nothing. So you have to be very careful, always look at the perspective of, does it do what it says on the tin? And this stuff never does what it says on the tin, except it gets politicians re-elected and it gets revenue streams for bureaucrats.
Arthur, I think one of the interesting things that you're touching on there is does this work? Is this, is it a functional kind of way of approaching security? One of the most interesting phrases on the Prism slides that we've seen so far is the phrase "do both" when they're referring to kind of the upstream retention of general data and then the supposed backdoor direct access thing, because surely whatever a government doesn't know from its own surveillance, the tech companies do from the passive kind of compliance that most of us who use social media engage with. Ken, does this work?
It's a very difficult argument to really satisfactorily answer. I mean, they'll certainly claim that it works, and they have been talking about declassifying instances where it has worked, just to say that this is the kind of thing we're able to do because of these technologies. They were quite clear, sort of as you're saying, that it's the idea of do both, that these systems link in with other information systems and human intelligence and other things, and that's perhaps how they work. And I think the political debate is the one about, well, what's the trade-off? And is the trade-off really, really worth it? The problem we have, and this was the one really highlighted by Casper, is we're outside this. We're sitting outside. We can debate all we want about it, but it's slightly chaotic. We're tilting at a windmill here because the US will do what's in the US's interest. Yeah. And we shouldn't really be surprised that it's going to do that.
Cool. Could we get Sive on the line there? Sive McCarthy is the director at the Centre for Irish and European Security in Brussels.
Hello.
Hi, Sive. Can you hear me? Hi, welcome to the Science Gallery remotely. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. We're kind of in the middle of this debate at the moment. We've covered a various number of things, but what I'm interested in asking you is about the element of breaches of trust in terms of the NSA and Prism. In your capacity and with your expertise, how do you view how trust has been perhaps damaged by this, and how trust is also bolstered by such stringent security measures?
Okay, thanks, Julia. I've actually been more or less following this debate, so I couldn't quite hear what Casper has been saying. In general terms, first of all, I would have to say that when the justification for a Prism type operation is counter-terrorism, the counter-terrorism measure of Prism is probably not just countering terrorism, which has a lot of other impacts as well. And that's why we start to have kind of trust issues where we're thinking, well, what are they doing over and above the thing that they're explicitly saying they're doing? Because Prism is a US system, the level of trust is very difficult for us, because as an immediate citizen, I don't need to have a trust relationship with the US government. That's not my role. So the trust for us is really about how do we now, what expectations do we have of the EU or the member states, whatever nationality or the Irish government? What are they going to do to protect us from what we would perceive to be inappropriate actions? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, what are they going to do?
Well, I don't know. You see, one of the things that happens, and really will probably, I guess, what is maybe interesting to say, the data problem is, right, what the US is doing is saying that they can look at foreign data, means that anything we do, what we consider normal daily life routine, whether it's social media, Twitter, or Facebook, or Google, that data is being held in the US. Casper has been talking about this legislation for years, it's completely right. Once the data is out of your EU jurisdiction, then really, the NSA Prism system, we don't have a responsibility and a role there. Our trust must be that our systems, our data protection, and our policymakers will look after our interests. And that's the more interesting thing for me, to say, what's going to happen now? Is the EU going to look at its economic relationship with the US, and will it prioritise its economic relationship over its societal relationship, protecting its citizens' privacy? Or would it say, no, actually, this is a step too far?
Okay. So we're having a little bit of difficulty hearing you there. I was wondering if you could speak a little louder, maybe a little slower, just because our line is a little bit dodgy. Would that be okay?
Sure.
Okay, cool. What was your initial reaction to this when you started reading it? I mean, what was your gut reaction in terms of what this means? The minutiae of it or the big picture?
My gut reaction was no surprise. I was actually surprised that people were surprised, because this is no surprise at all. My second reaction was I was strangely, I was surprised. The only surprise I had was that I had an expectation that they didn't have the competence in this area, but actually they do have technical competence. The thing is, I slightly disagree with Arthur. Sometimes he says it never works. That's probably not true. Of course it does work sometimes, but the proportionality test is not met. But the number of times it works, the collection of the data is disproportionate to the effectiveness. And then finally, the big picture is what is the legitimacy of this? Is this a legitimate thing? If you can't see with some transparency what the court orders are that allow them to do this type of surveillance, or how those decisions are being made, then can we really say that it's a legitimate action?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point, Sive. And listen, I'm going to leave it there because we're kind of pressed for time, but thank you so much for your contribution. Take care. Can we get Alexander on the line there? Arthur, would you like to? Yeah, you can come in. You can come in while we're doing this.
Of course, if it works 1 in a million times, then it has technically worked. But Sive is right. It's the proportionality argument. Is it effective? Is it a useful use of our resources? More importantly, does anybody here feel more secure, having been through what we've been through for the last 15 years, and now that we know that we're being surveilled like this? Does anybody feel more secure? No, so it isn't making us more secure.
Cool, thanks. Alexander, thank you very much for joining us. Alexander Klimberg. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can. Hi from Vienna.
You advise lots of different countries and organisations and so on cybersecurity. In a global context, the focus has been on the US. Obviously, there are implications internationally. Would you agree with the statement that this leak and revelation is frightening but not surprising?
Oh, I absolutely would agree. As some of your previous speakers said, this stuff is not exactly news. A lot of countries have been doing things. Also, the NSA has been doing similar stuff for many, many years. Just 2001, for instance, the European Parliament revealed to the world Echelon, which of course was a SIGINT intelligence system, not totally dissimilar to what we're talking about today, only it was concentrated on satellite communication. Now, most of the internet traffic, of course, is on cable, and therefore it's not surprising that 12 years later, also with the growth of the internet, you have a massive concentration on internet-related capabilities and infrastructure. So anybody who thought that Echelon was just simply a blip, of course, was wrong. Also, it's interesting to point out that the global war on terrorism did provide a very convenient front to expand these capabilities. And while we're constantly hearing about their effectiveness in counterterrorism measures, nobody should really be fooled by it. Nobody really cares about the counterterrorism issues in this. This is about espionage and counter-espionage, and is regarding cyber attacks. And cyber attacks really are a very, very serious problem. I would at least say 80–90% of cyber attacks are never published, and remain secret within government, but also within private companies. So this is not something actually you can just do a Google or look up on Wikipedia. There's a lot happening that never makes the public sphere, and it's all regarding cyber attacks and cyber espionage. And to understand cyber espionage, you need to keep in mind that 3 different types of cyber espionage, at least we talk about here today. The first type is persistent presence, in which you're established, for instance, on a PC, for instance, that you gain access to via Trojan. Then you have intercept, which you use on cables or other forms of communication. And the third type is you have access to data sets, for instance, held by corporations or by other governments. And what we're talking about in the context of the Prism program are also Boundless Informer, or Stellar Wind, or all the other programs that were recently revealed through one single whistleblower. There are different, actually, types of intercept methods, and on the whole, their benefit for counterterrorism is quite low, I would say. However, they do probably help in dealing with other issues, such as, for instance, cyber attacks.
Yeah. Can I just come in there, Alexander? If you're saying that the benefit for counter-terrorism is quite low. What is this actually for then?
So I think, in my opinion, so this is my, of course, just private opinion, and I'm not speaking as a senior advisor to the Austrian government in this context or to NATO, but in my opinion, these are primarily for establishing attribution to cyber attacks in cyberspace. As most of your listeners and viewers will know, that it's very, very difficult to establish attribution in cyberspace. It's nearly impossible to do that with internet means. And what you do instead is you rely on other means. Other means, of course, means other forms of intelligence. And what the West does is that they, instead of getting access to your computer, they tap your cables. The Chinese and the Russians just get access to your computer. The West taps your cables, and the companies just go through your data. But they all have the same thing in mind. They want to establish attribution of who's looking at whose networks and who's stealing what information.
And where do you stand on this current confusion over what Prism is? Is it just like the director of national intelligence is saying, it's not undisclosed collection of data mining program, but that it's this internal government system that has been kind of going on since 2007, 2008, or do you think it is this larger unilateral backdoor direct server access type thing as has been alleged by Edward Snowden?
I really couldn't comment on any specific government program like that, also because the comments in the media are partially contradictory and also don't necessarily match with what we know. As I said before, there's two different ways to get intelligence that are used by Western signal intelligence organizations. The second one is, of course, tapping the cable intercept, and the third is access to data. I've seen press reports that imply that Prism is both, but you also talked about Boundless Informer beforehand, which is a much wider-reaching program, and which would also have which also definitely would be signal intelligence-based, i.e., would be on internet nodes, deep packet inspection, looking at all the data that goes through those cables rather than accessing companies' databases.
Yeah, can you just tell us a little bit about Boundless Informer and what you know about it?
Well, that type of activity is the type 2 attack that I referred to beforehand. So the intercept attack, also known as lawful intercept, LI in security circles. It's the most common form of intelligence by Western intelligence agencies and police, and is very common in Europe. So I want to be clear, anybody who thinks that this is a US issue alone is very, very, very mistaken. This is very common. I would say most countries in Europe have a similar program, and some of these countries have a very transparent program. Sweden, for instance, talks about their own version of FISA and their own version of the FISA courts on their website. And anybody who wants to really have a close look at this matter, they should go have a look at Swedish websites and talk to the Swedish government, and you will find out that they have similar capabilities, maybe even stronger capabilities than Boundless Informer, and they've had a public discussion on it, and they've decided that it works in their context of liberty. So for me, the biggest problem is that other countries, of course, might have such programs and haven't had a chance to discuss it publicly, and I think that's a grievous mistake.
Alexander, what happens next?
For the whistleblower, or for the NSA program, or for what?
For the general debate in terms of the bigger picture thing, and also to Edward Snowden.
I would say that the fate of Mr. Snowden is probably going to be either in publishing or is probably going to be in hiding. So I very much hope it's not both at the same time. But in terms of what will happen in the future regarding these NSA programs, well, there was a survey, I think, yesterday in the U.S. media that the majority of Americans actually agreed with these types of activities, and they even would go even further. I even saw the number that 46 or 47% of the American citizens would actually think it acceptable for the NSA to supervise all of their internet communication, which, funnily enough, is exactly what happens in Russia and in China. So maybe they have actually a lot in common there.
Listen, Alexander, thank you very much for dropping in to us. We really appreciate your time and your insight.
My pleasure. Congratulations on your event.
Thank you. Okay, guys, we have 5 minutes left, and we're going to take some questions to the panel here. We've got a little roving mic somewhere.
Thank you. Specifically for Ken, because of your biog, I'm assuming you know something about the Troubles in the north. So if you just, it's an assumption, so if you apply what we have now with Prism, etc., the NSA being able to tap everything to the Troubles, and say the British and Irish intelligence services had been able to do something similar, would that have helped the fight against terrorism up there? Would that have possibly saved lives? How effective might it have been?
Counterfactual, as you kind of love them. Well, I think there's an important point that if you're engaged in a clandestine paramilitary or terrorist campaign, you're probably not going to use, your Google Plus circle to, discuss targets and things like that. So I think there's a limited sense in which it would have been useful. I'm sure there was wiretapping and phone bugging. I'm not an expert on counterterrorism in the north specifically, but I think they had much more effective use, although it wasn't always in the interest of saving lives. Sometimes it was quite the opposite, in the use of human intelligence and human resources. And I think that's where they focused. And I think in that kind of geographically concentrated terrorist campaign, where there's specific groups, identifiable communities, largely within the boundaries of just 2 states that you have to concentrate on, it doesn't make a lot of sense to pursue this kind of program. I think part of the issue here is that you have a disparate, networked, decentralized organization, to the extent that you can even call it an organization, that the US has identified as the justification for why they have these programs. And it is a better fit for that kind of thing, rather than something quite narrow, as in the case of Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting topic, but if we could keep the questions, Prism and NSA related to what we're discussing at hand, that'd be great, but it is an interesting point. Another question?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
A little later, if that's possible.
I just finished writing a work that took me years of research to write, and it was on basically covering what you're talking about and snooping, but one part that's disappointing to hear over and over is the propagation of the lie that 9/11 was committed by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. That's absolute rubbish.
Cool, we're not going to get into that right now because we could be going on for hours about that.
But it's coming back into the main argument with
Prism. Cool, if you could just make your point NSA or Prism related, because that's the topic that we're discussing at hand.
Okay,
that'd be great.
Don't trust the intelligence agencies. Simple as that.
Okay, thank you very much. Next.
How you doing? My name is Daniel Deering. I'm from the Centre for Irish and European Security. And it's just a comment that I want to make, an observation. Before we as Europeans get carried away with our indignation about what took place with the NSA and how the Americans could cast such a wide surveillance net over its citizens, just 2 points to remember. We've been active participants in the Patriot Act with handing over PNR data in 2008, and some of our own MEPs over the last 6 weeks to 8 weeks have been exposed as copying and pasting US lobby group amendments from Google and Amazon into the upcoming data protection regulations. So I think we need to look at ourselves first before we start to look abroad.
And I think that point has been made, that this is not, anyone who thinks that this is an issue for US and US citizens, it completely is not, and we need to examine things on a wider scale. Just up there, we're going to just take 2 more questions, and then if anybody wants to kind of chat afterwards.
Can I briefly to that? Purely by coincidence, like a few months ago, I happened to be walking down the street in Dublin, and who did I meet but Eric Holder, who had apparently come over to Ireland to express his special gratitude for our cooperation with his security activities. And so the special branch in their dodgy looking suits were all standing around looking very slightly edgy and also pretty happy with themselves. So yeah, just to add to it.
Can you explain to the audience who Eric Holder is?
Eric Holder is the United States Justice Secretary, isn't it the right term?
Attorney General.
Attorney General, yes. Yes, the Attorney General. And he's an extremely dodgy character.
In your opinion. Okay, we're going to take one more question.
Hi, I was just wondering, you've repeatedly said things about how no terrorist is going to be using Google Plus to organise things and everything, and we know that they are generally, the ones who actually are effective are generally smarter than, using their emails, and the idiots are generally useless at actually doing anything particularly effective. So isn't this just a really stupid way, a really inefficient way of using our resources to try and catch these people?
Not only is it inefficient, but it's counterproductive and it erodes your liberties. It doesn't make you any more secure one iota. I completely agree with you. But as with something like the Prevention of Terrorism Act, there were tens of thousands of arrests under it, usually because people were being targeted because either local police didn't like them or somebody higher up didn't like them, but the number of people who are actually successfully prosecuted under these laws is tiny. So the problem is, yes, we're all complicit, yes, we're all supporting it by not complaining about it, but we're making ourselves less secure and we're eroding our civil liberties by going along with it.
Cool. Could I just take some final points from each of the panelists here? If you could keep any kind of thought or major argument or piece of debate to take away from this afternoon. If you want to start, Mary, if you could keep it to about 30 seconds, that'd be great.
Well, I guess I'd just like to say that it's no surprise to me that this level of information is being collected. That I was surprised that it made such a big story, because anybody who's involved in this, basically involved in computers or the internet, knows the level of activity that is being monitored. So I was surprised that it was a big story.
Thank you. Ken?
Just one thing on that specific point. Yes, if this was all they were doing, it would be a stupid thing to do. But for example, Al-Shabaab in Somalia have a Twitter account. So part of what they're doing in connection with more other intelligence gathering services is looking at radicalization, things like that. So it is part of a broader spectrum of things. But its effectiveness, I think you're right, is debatable.
Billy?
We need to keep the debate going on proportionality and oversight, but always bring it home. Remember the extraordinary laws we introduced when we felt we were subject to terrorism. So it's not just an American phenomenon.
Thank you. And Arthur?
Echo that. You can't trade liberty for security. You have to hold on to both. You have to assert your rights, and you have to be critical of people who are incompetent and have got us into this situation in the first place. And overreaction when crises happen doesn't fix the problem.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks so much to our guests here today and to our Skype drop-ins as well. Thanks so much for you guys for coming down and engaging in what was hopefully an informative and interesting discussion. Thank you very much to the Science Gallery and their rapid response capabilities, and to Sean and Fionn and everyone else here. And keep the debate going and keep it going across all of those social networks that, of course, are completely transparent. Take care.